Ireland during the Hundred Years' War is a subject that gets very much neglected. There are certain subjects within the Hundred Years' War in Ireland that does get touched on a lot, but Ireland in the Hundred Years' War gets pretty much completely avoided because many people see Ireland as a part of England during the Hundred Years' War and not having its own separate history. And so what happens is that Ireland gets completely neglected, which is a terrible sin in a way, because during the Hundred Years' War, many countries such as England, France, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, they start to see their national identity being born during the Hundred Years' War. And reviewing this and going through the history myself, I found Ireland was no different. In fact, Ireland finds its roots of the very things that makes it a republic today within the Irish Parliament. Its foundations are found here. One of the lead protagonists in all of this, a person that's somewhat completely forgotten in Irish history, is Maurice Fitzgerald, the first Earl of Desmond, a man who was pushing to become King of Ireland at the time, well, rumoured to be pushing to be King of Ireland, who eventually becomes head of Parliament, an Irish Parliament, and truly is a person that is watched upon by England because everyone knows that Maurice Fitzgerald is ultimately trying to become the head of his new country that he's trying to put together, while other countries are starting to emerge. Now, no country emerges during the Hundred Years' War because it's still the medieval period, but the foundations of all of this starts to be put into place during this period. Now, the foundation of this would lead on to 400 years of fighting between Britain and Ireland, but you can see the root cause of it here during the Hundred Years' War. Now, before the Hundred Years' War, Ireland was already in the middle of the Gaelic resurgence. This had started around 1250 with the rise of Brian O'Neill and had further escalated going into the start of the 14th century with the Scottish War of Independence, when Edward the Bruce would come in and invade Ireland. And although he had failed, many of the Gaelic lords started to rise up against the Normans, who were supported by the English crown. The Battle of Dysa O'Dea had further escalated more and more push against the English crown. Eventually, even Norman lords themselves would start to go independent against the crown in Ireland and would start to forge their own kingdoms, one of which Maurice Fitzgerald, the first Earl of Desmond, who was supposed to be the king's representative in Ireland, but had pretty much gone rogue against him. Furthermore, in the start of the Hundred Years' War, another Norman family, a family that was supposed to be very much a part of the crown in Ireland, had broken into a civil war after the Brown Earl, William de Burgh, had killed his own cousin. He'd put him into an oubliette and left him starved to death. In return, one of the bodyguards, a personal member of the de Burgh family, was left sickened and went out of his way to murder the Brown Earl. This would cause a civil war where many branches of the de Burghs would start to murder each other. Furthermore, anyone related to them in England would come into Ireland to look to take back lands that they believed was rightfully belonging to them through inheritance. You also had Gaelic, who were the native Irish in the country, that believed that that was their ancestors' land. So they too started to take back land that rightfully belonged to them. It wasn't long until both Connacht and Ulster, at the start of the Hundred Years' War, would break away from the English crown. The English crown would lose complete control of these areas, and much of these territories would be taken over either by the native Gaelic or Normans that had gone independent and rogue away from the crown. The English crown losing control of both Ulster and Connacht, it wouldn't be long until he lost control of Munster as well. Maurice Fitzgerald, the first Earl of Desmond, was rumoured to look to become King of Ireland, and with the death of his wife in 1331, who happened to be the de Burgh, Maurice Fitzgerald, he was now looking to get himself a wife that would give him political advantage in Ireland. especially when rumours of him looking to become king may be true. Maurice Fitzgerald went off and married Conor O'Brien's daughter, Margaret O'Brien. Margaret O'Brien was the ancestor of Brian Boru, who was Emperor of the Gael, Emperor of Ireland. With this, Maurice had a good standing in becoming King of the Irish. Furthermore, he also brought in coin and livery. Basically, he was able to hold feasts in the Brehon law, Irish law, where he would be able to employ both Norman lords and Gaelic lords, and mercenaries from both the Gaelic world and the Norman world in a Gaelic law, and hire them and swear allegiance to him, allowing him to hire Gallowglass, Kerns, Norman knights, the lot. By the start of the 100 Years' War between 1337 to 1453, it appeared that Ireland for the most part had gone independent from the English crown. What was left of the English crown in Dundalk, Dublin, Waterford and Kilkenny was referred to as the Pale. The rest of Ireland, on the other hand, was divided between Gaelic lords and Norman lords that had gone independent from the English crown. Sir John Darcy, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1342, joined up with the rest of the English in an expedition to Flanders as part of the 100-Year War. This is important because this is the first army to leave from Ireland. This army at this point is made up of English from the Pale. England had planned for the rest of the war that most troops coming out of Ireland would be more of the civilised English. However, as we go through the next few armies to come out of Ireland, this isn't the case. The English are occupied with the Scots and the French, and this army that comes out of Ireland in 1342 would go on to both Scotland and France in various campaigns between 1345 to 1346. In 1346 specifically, they would take part in the Battle of Courcey. Sir John Darcy would win himself many titles and a lot of land. This is fitting for not just the English that lived in Ireland, but also for the Irish lords and the Gaelic, who would look to go to Dublin, give their allegiance to the English crown, and take part in the 100 Years' War. You see, as I said earlier, this isn't the modern era, where you have modern nationalism. In fact, this is the medieval period. This means that many Gaelic lords and mercenaries from Gallowglass and Kerns could easily go to Dublin, join one of these armies, go to France, fight for a few years, gain some coin, some money, some titles, return back home, use the influence that they had gained in France to better use back home in Ireland. They didn't see this as a form of treachery or treason. No one did in the medieval period. Although Maurice Fitzgerald, 1st Earl of Desmond, had gone independent from the English crown, he still had enough connections to be able to join the 100 Years' War. You see, the other branch of the Fitzgeralds, the Earls of Kildare, the Kildare branch as they're known as, was still in between both the Gaelic world and the English world. They would both take part in various activities with other Irish clans, the Gaelic clans, but they would also show up in the English court and take part in various English activities. The Kildare Fitzgeralds had a foot in both the Gaelic world and the English world, which gave their cousin branch, the Desmond Fitzgeralds, an opportunity to join the Kildare Fitzgeralds in the 100-Year War. Also, the head of the family of both Desmond Fitzgerald and Kildare Fitzgerald have the same first name, Maurice, as well, so they're both referred to as Maurice Fitzgerald. So for the rest of this video, I will be referring to them as such. Went over, raised their levies, which were at this point were made up of both Gaelic and Normans, and joined the English in the 100-Year War. In the 10th of July 1344, they went to England first and then went over to France. Desmond Fitzgerald had 20 men-at-arms and 50 Gaelic horsemen, light infantry who had no saddles or stirrup, but were able to flank quite easy. Edward III quite appreciated these Gaelic who were able to skirmish and raid quite easy for him, giving him more opportunities during the 100 Years' War. However, in 1345, on the return of the Fitzgeralds to Ireland, the Fitzgeralds would go into a full-on rebellion against the English crown. Reasons are hard to find. Was it down to the fact that the Fitzgeralds were looking to become kings of Ireland, in particular Desmond Fitzgerald? Or was this all a rumour set up by Elizabeth Butler to remove the Fitzgeralds, who happened to be her biggest rival? Elizabeth Butler, at the time, was standing in as the head of the Butler family, since her husband had passed away and her son was not old enough yet to take the head of the family. Elizabeth Butler most likely came up with a plan to remove the Fitzgeralds by telling the English Parliament that the Fitzgeralds were planning on usurping them and placing themselves as the kings of Ireland. Is this true? Well, the evidence towards the Fitzgeralds looks like it could have been. It could have been the fact that the Fitzgeralds were looking to rebel and make themselves kings of Ireland. This is difficult to see, but as time goes on, perhaps they are. Regardless, the Earl of Kildare was arrested and brought to Dublin. Desmond Fitzgerald, on the other hand, held a meeting in Kilkenny where he outright took rebellion. He refused to go to Dublin to be arrested and continued to attack the English for another 2 years. By 1346, both the Gaelic and Hiberno-Normans of Leinster and Munster were going out of their way to attack any English that they found. In the annals, it is written that the peaceful people of England were being burned, plundered and killed wherever they were able to be found. The Hiberno-Normans, who were referred to as the Gaul, and the Gaelic were moving into Leinster, capturing various castles. By June, Walter de Birmingham had arrived in Ireland to try to bring justice back in and try to reconquer Leinster and Munster that had been taken over by Desmond Fitzgerald and various other Hiberno-Normans and Gaelic. Gaelic clans up in the north had also gone into Dundalk and sacked it, killing 400 people in Dundalk. However, by this time, Edward III wasn't really entertained by Ireland and really needed Kildare Fitzgerald's men. He forgave Kildare Fitzgerald and he was brought over from Ireland to France with both his Gaelic and Hiberno-Normans to aid him in his siege in France. On Maurice Fitzgerald's return, the Black Death would soon follow him. In 1347, Desmond Fitzgerald was finally defeated and arrested. His lands were forfeited and he was forced by the English to answer for his charges. However, Kildare Fitzgerald, who had already been on the good graces of Edward III, was able to spend the next few years getting back Fitzgerald's lands, Desmond Fitzgerald's territory. By 1348, Desmond was released, and by 1349, he had been gotten a pardon by Edward III. Now at this point, you can quite clearly see that the 100-Year War wasn't just used by the English living in Ireland to justify themselves with fancy titles, to get granted land, and also to take wealth from the French, to bolster up themselves, to purchase more castles, to buy more men. But you can also see that Hiberno-Norman lords, the Gaul as they're known as in the literature, were also doing the same thing. The Hiberno-Normans that had served Edward III in France were going back to Ireland with leverage to hold themselves up. For example, Kildare Fitzgerald using his favour with Edward III to get back Desmond Fitzgerald's territories and lands that he'd lost. Kildare Fitzgerald was also in a good standing in the Irish Parliament as well, bolstering himself up. With this, by 1347 on his return, Kildare Fitzgerald was put in a very good place. However, what the Fitzgeralds didn't realise is most of their enemies would end up getting crippled with the arrival of the Black Death between 1347 and 1350. The English would be almost completely wiped out in Ireland, because most of the urban areas, the areas that were built up such as Cork, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, the places where the English were living, would end up being hit the hardest by the Black Death. But the Gaelic areas, and also the areas that the Fitzgeralds were living in, were big open areas, so the chances of being hit by the plague was lessened because of it. This would end up putting the Gaelic resurgence, the rise of the Gaelic in Ireland, from a steady progression to giving it to a form of ecstasy. It would be heightened up. The Gaelic would be taking back even more territory. During the periods of the Black Death, the English would still try to bring back order into Ireland and to retake territories for the crown. Leon of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, who was the son of Edward III, would be made Earl of Ulster. He would take the territories of the De Burghs back off of them, since they had gone independent from the crown. Leon of Antwerp would be a supporter of the Butlers, because the Butlers supported an English Ireland. However, Leon was not a fan of the Fitzgeralds, since the Fitzgeralds had been bringing in a more Gaelic Ireland. The plague had gotten so bad in Ireland that John de Larse, who was also head of the Knights Hospital and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the time, had died in 1349 in Dublin Castle. Thomas Rockby was sent to Ireland in 1349 to replace him. Thomas's main goal was to keep an eye on Desmond and also to reclaim lands lost in Munster. In 1353, Thomas went down with an English army down to McCarthy territories and would smash the McCarthys. He would then capture Dermot McCarthy, decapitate him, and have him replaced with Cormac McCarthy as a puppet king in that area. However, in 1354, on his return back to Dublin, the O'Byrne clan would rise up and smash Thomas. The McNamaras would also join the O'Byrne clan. However, of that year, Thomas would quickly fight back in another skirmish. He would capture McNamara and have him executed. However, Rockby suffered too many losses and had to pull his forces back out of Munster. Having been made a disgrace of, Thomas Rigby would return back to England in 1355. And between 1355 to 1356, the Fitzgeralds would take over the Irish Parliament. Desmond Fitzgerald would go on again and announce himself Lord Justice of Ireland for life. Given that Antwerp was overseas and the Butlers had been pushed to the side by the Fitzgeralds had, in part, become kings of Ireland. Although this isn't the end of the story quite yet. Sadly, of that year of 1356, with victory in the grasp of Desmond Fitzgerald, he would pass away, leaving the control of the country pretty much in the hands of Kildare Fitzgerald. However, with the first peace between France and England between 1360 to 1369, the English would use this opportunity to bring back order to Ireland. James Butler, on the 22nd of April 1364, was appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland by none other than Antwerp himself, Duke of Clarence. Clarence, from his arrival back in Ireland, placed great trust in James Butler, and for years it seems that the deputy, he was almost all-powerful, with Clarence supporting him. Of course, Fitzgerald, the 4th Earl of Kildare, clashed with the Butlers and Antwerp. This caused major friction between the two. In response to this, in 1364, the Earl of Kildare, Fitzgerald, would write a letter to the king, backed by many other Irish nobles, highlighting the corruption that Butler and Antwerp were doing in Ireland. The English king, surprisingly, would also support Kildare once again, and would remove many of Butler's supporters in Ireland. However, both Butler and Antwerp weren't touched. And now we move on to one of the most important parts in Irish medieval history, the Statutes of Kilkenny, 1366. The Statutes of Kilkenny is one of the most important things you should take away from medieval Ireland, and that is the segregation of two people that was enforced in 1366 by an English nobleman, Leon Antwerp, who had enough. He had seen himself as the successor of the Roman Empire, coming to Ireland to civilize these barbaric people that was infecting his clean, civilized English ways. This impact would continue even today, can be seen in Northern Ireland, in the way that people see themselves as civilized on one side and barbaric on the other, and they must physically enforce their civilized ways on another person. This is important because it can be used as a reference and to learn from for not just Ireland but people all over the world of ignorant towards other people. Ireland wasn't uncivilized. However, even in the time period itself, we have the likes of the first Earl of Desmond's son, Gerald the poet, who would continue to make some of his greatest music, all in Gaelic by the way, during this period. Complete poetry that was made during this period. We can use this as an example to show both Hiberno-Norman lords and Gaelic lords were still doing their own thing. They were still playing hurling, they were still composing Gaelic music, poetry, etc. Later on during this video, I will show you more examples of this throughout. In 1363, Elizabeth de Burgh had died, Antwerp's first wife, and was the main reason he could justify himself as Earl of Ulster. With her death, Antwerp would go on to marry his second wife, a French-Italian woman who owned territory, land, in both Italy and France. On their honeymoon, you could say, in Milan in 1368, Antwerp was believed to have been poisoned by a member of the de Burgh family, once again arguing over the territory in Ulster. Between 1367 and 1369, a year after the Statutes of Kilkenny, was a huge lull for the English in Ireland. In fact, Gerald Fitzgerald, the poet Fitzgerald, who had Gaelicized so much of Ireland already, had taken power in the Irish Parliament until 1369, when he would mysteriously disappear. Many people don't know what happened to Gerald Fitzgerald. He had many enemies, and many people do wonder who killed him. Was it his wife, who happened to be a butler? Was it the O'Briens? In fact, recently in Baraty Castle, they found a body inside the walls. Many stories and many theories go about what happened to Gerald Fitzgerald. Regardless, afterwards, the English would be looking to take back Ireland and to anglicise it once again. Art McNamara is generally regarded as the most formidable of the later kings of Leinster. Art and Richard II of England spent much of their years between 1377 and 1395 fighting each other. Art McNamara married Elizabeth Laville. She was the daughter of Sir Robert Laville. This was completely against the Statutes of Kilkenny, and the Crown thus forfeited Elizabeth's lands. Elizabeth and Art would go on to have 3 sons together. Richard II would raise a levy of 10,000 men, the largest ever sent to Ireland at this point. Richard II would force Art into submission. However, on his departure of the first campaign, Art made much of his kingdom into a death trap for any invading English or Anglo-Irish forces. However, the English crown would see a huge blow on the 12th of July 1398 at the Battle of Kilstown, when Roger Mortimer, a man who had been given the lands too that Elizabeth had forfeited when marrying Art, rashly led out his force to face off against the O'Byrne and O'Toole clans. Roger would be killed in a side skirmish of the battle, although the king would raise a new large army out of England the next year. The war was over and the Gaelic resurgence of Ireland would continue to rise. Art MacNamara would die soon after Christmas 1417, perhaps in his bed in Ferns, or perhaps he was poisoned in New Ross in another war between the Gaelic and the Irish, or perhaps even against another Gaelic clan. Regardless, with the 100 Years' War and Richard II's campaign in Ireland, the English king had been seen as a failure. And so, during his second campaign in Ireland in 1399, the man who would become Henry IV would rebel against him while he campaigned in Ireland. Richard II locked up Henry IV's son, who would become Henry V, in Trim Castle in Ireland. He then quickly got his army and rushed back to England, only to be usurped, locked up, and once again, just like other men who had died previously, Richard II would end up being starved to death. Now, moving over from Richard II's campaign in Ireland to the focus now being back in France. One of the major Irish lords to go from Ireland back over to France is James Butler, the 4th Earl of Ormonde. He was in France between 1415 and 1429 on and off. Beforehand, before he goes over to France as well, he's also active in 1402 with a major war between himself and the Earl of Desmond. The MacWilliams, interestingly enough, who at this time are the De Burghs, they're a branch of the De Burgh family, who are very Gaelicized, in fact support the Butler family. So although the Butlers are seen as a very English family supporting the Statutes of Kilkenny, the reality is James Butler can in fact speak, his first language is in fact Irish, and most of his men that serve him are also Irish. How do we know this? Because people in the English court ask him about Ireland and ask him about various things about him. He has a full interview that is written down that I will link below. So we know that James Butler's first language is Irish and that he has Gaelic men in his retinue. So you can see straight away that it's still much more complicated than you would think, it being English and Irish, even this late into the period, and the Statutes of Kilkenny being in full flow. And the Statutes of Kilkenny does get used to arrest certain players in the game. It's not a case of it's being completely ignored, it's complicated. James Butler goes over to France, and in 1418 he takes part in some of the most brutal violence in France, according to the Annals of Connacht. It's written in the Annals of Connacht as well that he didn't just have English nobles under him, but he also has Gauls, Hiberno-Normans and Gaelic lords. It doesn't list out names of who served under him, but one can assume that it would be anyone who was under him in Kilkenny and in the Leinster area. On Henry V's return and his time in England, Henry V would propose an Irish crusade in 1421. However, in 1422, the English king would be poisoned in France. It's reported in the Annals of Connacht that his mother-in-law and wife of the King of France had actually poisoned him, which is quite interesting that it's written in the Annals of Connacht. Now, this is the important part that gets the story of the Fitzgeralds back into the main focus. Heading back up north, at the start of the 100 Years' War, the De Burgh family, a Hiberno-Norman family that had originated out of England, had lost control of the north and broke into civil fighting. The Gaelic would obviously take full advantage of this, and by 1435 the O'Neills had taken full control of the north of Ireland, but secretly, and we wouldn't find this out until later on, is that the Fitzgeralds and the O'Neills had been doing secret dealings the whole time. And eventually, during the War of the Roses, the Fitzgeralds and the O'Neills would start going to each other's aid. Which goes to show that most likely the O'Neills and the Fitzgeralds had been secretly supporting each other, possibly the whole time. With the 100 Years' War coming to an end in France, and the majority of Ireland under Gaelic and Hiberno-Norman control, Ireland would enjoy the rest of the Gaelic Renaissance. As a show of wealth and power, Margaret O'Carroll in 1433, a Gaelic woman by the way, holds two of the biggest feasts in Europe. There she shows off a massive amount of wealth, inviting guests not only from Ireland, but from across Europe as well. In these feasts, Margaret O'Carroll would wear a golden dress, similar to what you would see in Waterford today. Meanwhile, her husband would be outside the castle, galloping around in a chariot, screaming and roaring, revving up the crowd. It's a huge celebration. Harpists and the best of Gaelic culture would be there, bagpipes and many more. This was truly a great celebration and really shows that we had gone into a new golden age, as Irish Parliament was slowly being controlled more and more. One wonders what the Fitzgeralds were secretly up to the whole time. But that's a story for a different video. A video I've actually already made with Ireland and the Wars of the Roses. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, subscribe to the channel. We're doing merch below, trying to add more stuff all the time. It's specifically aimed at Irish medieval history. We're also covering a bit of Scottish history as well with clans and dynasties. So if you're into Gaelic history or just Irish medieval history or a good bit of Scottish history as well, definitely check the link below and get yourself some merchandise. It's not just merchandise for the page, but it's also t-shirts from any clan that you want. And if you can't find your clan there, definitely leave a comment below and we'll put something together for you. And if you have any other ideas for any merchandise or any videos you'd like to see in the future, definitely comment below. And if you have any questions, please ask straight away. I love answering them, and so far I've put together a pretty awesome community that I love talking to. And if you want to be a part of that community as well, just leave a comment below and just chat away to me. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, and as always, subscribe, press the bell button so you can see these videos come up, and all the best.